Usually when we look at the actual mechanics of solving a crime, there's this fundamental expectation of precision.
Right, like a formula.
Exactly. It's treated almost like structural engineering. Investigators secure a scene, they locate a stray fingerprint on a discarded weapon, they run it through an automated database, and then the system just spits out a definitive binary match.
Yeah, you get a name on a screen, and the chaos is just instantly contained.
Right, it's very neat, very tidy. But the moment you step into the investigative landscape of the Zodiac killer, that entire empirical apparatus just fractures.
Just completely shatters.
Yeah. We aren't looking at a clean database match today. We are stepping out onto a foggy 1960s San Francisco street corner, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp, and we're surrounded by an absolute hurricane of contradictory data, unsolvable mathematics, and frankly, intense psychological manipulation.
Which is exactly why we're digging into this today.
Yes. If you are listening to this and you are the kind of learner who wants the raw substance without all the static, someone who is insanely curious and wants to pull apart the machinery of a subject without feeling overwhelmed by unstructured noise, then this deep dive is precisely for you.
Absolutely.
We are not just doing a standard true crime timeline today. We are undertaking an intellectual autopsy of an unsolved obsession.
And we are working from an incredible stack of source material to actually do this.
We really are.
We've got the original unredacted police files and crime scene summaries, but we're also pulling heavily from a highly technical 2023 university lecture on classical cryptography.
That's from the Informatics Institute at the University of Amsterdam, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating stuff. Plus, we have a dense 2020 academic paper from the International Journal of English Literature and Social Sciences that mathematically deconstructs the killer's subconscious grammar.
Which is mind-blowing. We'll get into that.
And of course, we are tracking the most recent investigative updates stretching right through 2025 and 2026 regarding both the prime suspects and that fiercely guarded DNA evidence.
So to understand the sheer scale of the psychological warfare we are dealing with here, we have to put ourselves on the ground on October 11th, 1969.
Right.
We have to look at how a localized string of murders was weaponized into a nationwide panic. Let's look at the murder of Paul Stine.
Such a tragic case.
It really is. Stine was 29 years old, a student, a husband, and he was driving a cab in San Francisco. On that Saturday night, he picks up a passenger and drives him to the wealthy neighborhood of Presidio Heights, to the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets.
And for simply doing his job, Stine is shot point blank in the skull.
Yeah.
But the murder itself, as horrific as it is just the catalyst for a catastrophic procedural failure.
This part is so incredibly frustrating to read about.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because the crime happens in a dense, affluent residential area, it doesn't go unnoticed. 3 young witnesses actually observe the crime in progress from the second-floor window of a home directly across the street.
Wow.
They watch the killer wiping down the cab, they watch him walk away, and they immediately call the police, who dispatch units to the scene right away.
And this is where the precision of law enforcement just completely derails.
Yeah, the fatal error.
The witnesses provide a description of the suspect, but somewhere in that frantic relay between the emergency dispatcher and the responding patrol cars, a massive mistake happens. The radio broadcast describes the suspect as a black male.
Which changes everything. Officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms are rushing to the intersection of Washington and Cherry, and as they approach the area, they observe a white male walking away from the crime scene.
Right.
This individual matches the actual physical description of the killer down to the exact clothing.
Yeah.
But because they are operating on flawed data, a radio call specifically directing them to look for a black male, they do not detain him.
They just drive right past him.
They drive right past the Zodiac killer.
The compounding tragedy of that single moment is just staggering. But what happens next is what elevates this from a horrific local murder to a case of mass psychological terrorism.
The shift in his methodology.
Exactly. Initially, the San Francisco Police Department assumes this is just a routine, albeit tragic, robbery gone wrong. A cab driver killed for his nightly fare.
Which happens, say.
Right. But then the San Francisco Chronicle receives a letter. The envelope contains a piece of paper that starts with the phrase, and this is chilling. This is the Zodiac speaking.
And the letter claims explicit responsibility for the murder of the taxi driver of Washington and Maple.
Yeah.
Though, the final resting place of the cab was slightly down the block at Cherry.
Yeah, a minor discrepancy, but clearly the same event.
But to definitively bypass any police skepticism or, assumptions of a hoax, The sender includes a piece of physical, undeniable proof. Yes. Enclosed in the envelope is a blood-stained piece of Paul Stine's shirt, physically torn from his body by the killer before he walked away from the cab.
I mean, that is just visceral proof. And he doesn't just claim the murder, he weaponizes the police department's own error against them.
He's gloating.
He openly mocks the officers in the letter for failing to apprehend him when they were quite literally looking at him. He claims he even stopped and had a brief conversation with them.
Which may or may not be true, but it feeds the myth.
Right, but the true escalation, the mechanism that completely paralyzed the entire state of California, is at the very end of this letter. I'm going to read the exact text here.
Go ahead.
He writes, "School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning, just shoot out the front tire, plus pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, analyzing that specific threat reveals a profound shift in the killer's operational psychology.
How so?
We'll look at the confirmed attacks prior to October 1969, December 1968 at Lake Herman Road, July 1969 at Blue Rock Springs, and September 1969 at Lake Berryessa.
The earlier ones.
Right. These were all geographically isolated environments, classic Lover's Lane environments. He was targeting vulnerable young couples in areas where he controlled the perimeter and the timeline.
He had the upper hand territorially.
Exactly. Moving into Presidio Heights, which is a densely populated, highly visible urban center, and executing a victim in a cab, and then explicitly threatening children in broad daylight. That is a deliberate escalation of scale.
It's almost like a marketing campaign.
That's an interesting way to put it.
It's like he realized that the physical murders were just the marketing campaign, right? The bodies, the bloody scrap of Paul Stine's shirt, those were just the proof of concept to establish his credibility. But the actual product he was selling was mass hysteria.
That is a perfect analogy. And the logistics of the panic he caused were unprecedented. The threat against the school buses fundamentally altered the daily infrastructure of the Bay Area.
I can't even imagine being a parent at that time.
It was terrifying. You had armed police officers physically riding inside school buses. You had unmarked patrol cars tailing the bus routes. You even had aircraft planes and helicopters monitoring the school routes from above.
Wow.
The killer completely understood that the anticipation of violence, this invisible threat hanging over the most vulnerable population conceivable, was a far more effective tool of control than the violence itself.
He was holding millions of people hostage with a single piece of paper.
And a postage stamp. He later compounded this by sending diagrams of what he termed a death machine, an elaborate ANFO explosive device he claimed he would bury along the bus routes.
And when the police try to regain control of the narrative, they release a composite sketch based on the young witnesses from the Stine murder, and they publicly announce they have recovered bloody fingerprints from the cab.
Right. Standard police work.
But his reaction to this is pure public relations management. He immediately writes another letter entirely dedicated to dismissing the sketch, claiming he only looks like that when he's, quote, doing his thing.
Right.
And he completely dismisses the fingerprint evidence by claiming he coated his fingertips with airplane cement before the murder. He is actively, aggressively managing his own mythos in real time.
And that PR campaign relied heavily on the intellectual theater he created for the authorities.
The codes.
Yes. To generate and sustain this level of hysteria, he couldn't just rely on violent threats. Threats eventually lose their edge if they aren't acted upon.
People get numb to it.
Exactly. He needed an interactive mechanism. So he used complex cryptographic puzzles to force the public, the media, and the police to actively participate in his game.
Which brings us into the underlying mathematics of his terror campaign. And for this, we're pulling heavily from a February 2023 lecture titled Classical Cryptography, delivered by Karst Koymans at the Informatics Institute at the University of Amsterdam.
That lecture is brilliant.
It is, because it strips away all the true crime mythology and just looks purely at the mechanics of secret writing.
Establishing the baseline terminology from that lecture is really essential here. Koymans makes a crucial distinction between steganography and cryptography.
Right, break that down for us.
So steganography is the art of hidden writing, making the physical message itself invisible. Think of using invisible ink or hiding a microdot under a postage stamp.
Like spy stuff.
Exactly. Cryptography, on the other hand, which comes from the Greek kryptos, meaning concealed, doesn't hide the message. It scrambles it. The ciphertext is fully visible to anyone who looks at it, but it is mathematically incomprehensible without the key.
Okay, got it. And the lecture also highlights the two foundational systems of cryptography, right? Symmetric and asymmetric schemes.
Yes, in a symmetric scheme, which is also known as a secret key scheme, the exact same mathematical key is used to both encrypt the plain text and decrypt the ciphertext.
Meaning both people need the exact same password.
Precisely. For this to work securely, both the sender and the receiver must possess the key, and it has to be kept in absolute secrecy between them.
Okay.
Conversely, an asymmetric or public key scheme utilizes two distinct keys. There is a public key that anyone can use to encrypt a message, but the decryption requires a completely separate, strictly private key held only by the receiver.
So if I'm understanding this right, the Zodiac was essentially utilizing symmetric schemes, but he subverted the entire purpose of the system.
How so?
Well, instead of keeping the ciphertext a secret between two parties, he broadcast it to millions of people on the front pages of the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner.
Nice.
He practically dared the public to reverse engineer the symmetric key. And this ties directly into another foundational concept from the Amsterdam lecture, Kirchhoff's principle.
August Kirchhoff's, yeah. Late 19th century.
Right. Kirchhoff argued that a cryptographic system should not require secrecy of its underlying algorithm or its inner workings to remain secure.
The machine itself doesn't need to be a secret.
Exactly. The only element that must remain absolutely secret is the key itself. You can know exactly how the encryption machine works, but without the specific key, the ciphertext remains totally unbroken.
And the killer ciphers are a terrifying practical application of Kirchhoff's principle. He distributed 4 major ciphers during his campaign.
But we're focusing on the main two.
Yes, the two most analyzed are the Z408, which was sent in 3 separate parts to 3 different newspapers in July 1969, and the Z340 sent to the Chronicle in November 1969.
And just so we're clear, the numbers 408 and 340 just refer to the total number of characters in the cryptogram?
Correct, just the character count.
Okay, so the Z408 is fascinating to me because of how quickly it fell apart. It was cracked in August 1969, and not by the FBI or the NSA, but by a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty.
Amateurs beat the pros.
They really did, and the translated plaintext is a profound look into his pathology. I want to read the exact translation here, and I'm going to preserve the killer's specific, highly idiosyncratic spelling errors because they're important.
It's very important.
He wrote, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is when I die, I will be reborn in paradise and all the I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or atop my collectiog of slaves for my afterlife. Eburita methpiti."
The phonetic misspellings are immediately striking.
Right.
Paradise spelled with a C.
Right.
Forest with a double R. Animal with an A. And then there's that unbroken string of 18 characters at the very end. Eburita methpiti.
It's an unsettling wall of text, but the thing is, the Z408 was child's play compared to what came next.
Oh, absolutely.
The Z408 took a week to crack. The Z340, which was sent just a few months later, took 51 years.
Half a century.
It defied the greatest cryptographic minds in the world until December 2020, when a 3-person team software developer, David Orenchak, applied mathematician Sam Blake, and programmer Jarl Van Eyck finally broke the mathematical structure.
What's fascinating here is understanding exactly how they broke it, which requires looking at the structural difference between the two codes.
Walk us through that.
Well, the Z408 was a fairly straightforward homophonic substitution cipher. In English, the letter E appears with a frequency of about 12 to 13%.
It's the most common letter.
Right. So if you use a simple substitution cipher where one symbol always equals E, anyone tracking the frequency of the symbols will instantly crack it. They just look for the most common symbol.
Makes sense.
A homophonic substitution cipher attempts to flatten that frequency curve by assigning multiple different symbols to the most common letters.
Oh, I see.
So E might be represented by 7 different symbols. It makes the frequency analysis much harder, but as the Hardins proved, not impossible.
But the Z340 was different.
Very different. The reason the Z340 held out for 51 years is that the killer introduced an entirely new layer of mathematical obfuscation, which is transposition.
Meaning moving things around.
Exactly. He didn't just substitute the letters for symbols. He systematically jumbled the physical location of the symbols within the grid.
And the specific transposition he used is just mind-bending. The Z340 was a grid of 17 columns and 20 rows. For decades, analysts were reading it left to right, top to bottom, like a normal page of text.
Which is the natural human instinct.
Right. But Oranchak's team, running hundreds of thousands of algorithmic variations through a decryption software called AZ-Decrypt, discovered the geometric pattern the killer actually used.
Yes, he was utilizing a diagonal transposition.
Okay, let's unpack this for the listener because it's wild.
To read the true sequence of the symbols, you had to start at the top left corner, then move down one row and over two columns.
Down 1 over 2.
Down 1 over 2. You follow this diagonal path across the grid. When you hit the right edge, you wrap around to the left side and continue.
That is so complicated to write out by hand.
It is. Furthermore, he didn't apply this to the whole 20-row grid at once. He fractured the cipher into 3 separate horizontal segments, one of 9 rows, another of 9 rows, and a final segment of 2 rows.
Wait, so you have to do the diagonal thing within each chunk?
Yes. You had to execute this precise down 1 over 2 diagonal shift within each distinct segment before you even began attempting to decipher what the symbols actually meant.
And what makes it even more chaotic is that in the second 9-row segment, he made a mistake.
A crucial human error.
Yeah, he skipped a column while writing out the cipher, which pushed the rest of the diagonal alignment off by 1 position. That single accidental human error effectively broke the mathematical perfection of his own code, making it infinitely harder for computers to brute force the algorithm.
Because the computer's looking for perfect logic, and he introduced an illogical flaw.
Exactly. But when Oranchak, Blake, and Van Eyck finally accounted for that error and cracked the transposition, here is the message that emerged from the Z340 in 2020.
Let's hear it.
I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to cache me. That wasn't me in the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I'm not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death.
The reference to the TV show immediately timestamps the cipher's creation.
Right, the Jim Dunbar show.
Yes.
Yeah.
In October 1969, a high-profile local television broadcast hosted by Jim Dunbar received a call from someone claiming to be the Zodiac, saying, "I don't want to go to the gas chamber."
And everyone was watching that.
The Z340 was the killer's way of explicitly disavowing that caller as an imposter, while simultaneously reinforcing his own delusional mythology about the afterlife.
Right.
What is critical to pull from the Amsterdam lecture here is the historical context of this behavior. Koymans places the Zodiac ciphers within a long human lineage of cryptographic obsession.
It's not a new phenomenon.
Not at all. He references the Voynich manuscript, a 15th century illustrated codex written entirely in an unknown, uncracked writing system that has defied cryptanalysts and modern AI alike.
Wow.
He mentions Arthur Conan Doyle's The Adventure of the Dancing Men, where Sherlock Holmes decodes a cipher consisting entirely of stick figures. The killer intuitively understood that a puzzle hijacks the human imagination in a way that standard text simply cannot. A puzzle is inherently demanding. It forces the recipient to actively engage with the intellect of the creator.
But see, okay, let's unpack this. If we look closely at the actual text, we really have to question the narrative of the evil genius mastermind.
Ah, yes, the competency debate.
Right. Look at the end of the Z408 cipher. Ebure temeth piti. It is just an 18-character block of meaningless noise. Look at the spelling errors that carry over from the letters to the ciphers. Paradise, animal, forest.
It raises a significant question about his actual capability.
Was he a master cryptographer executing a brilliant mathematical design, or was he just throwing chaos at the wall?
Right.
It honestly reminds me of a young child sitting at a diner, drawing a maze on the back of a paper placemat. They draw so many dead ends, loops, and squiggly lines that eventually the maze becomes entirely impossible to solve. But it isn't impossible because the child is a genius architect operating on a higher intellectual plane.
No, of course not.
It is impossible because the child fundamentally broke the rules of maze construction. They don't even know the way out themselves. Did the Zodiac actually possess a deep understanding of cryptography? Or did he simply stack layers of confusion and transposition until the message became unreadable by sheer accidental density?
That specific debate dominated cryptographic circles for 50 years. Before 2020, highly respected analysts argued that the Z340 was an elaborate fake, just random symbols drawn to waste FBI man-hours.
Because it was so messy.
Exactly. The fact that Oranchak's team recovered a coherent, grammatically structured message proves that it was not a hoax. He did possess a system, he understood the mechanics of transposition and homophonic substitution, and he executed them.
But poorly.
Yes. Your analogy regarding the broken rules is highly relevant to his execution. The spelling errors, the leftover gibberish at the end of the 408, the crucial misalignment error in the second segment of the 340. These are the hallmarks of someone who is highly motivated, dangerously arrogant, but lacking the formal education or technical precision he desperately wanted to project.
He wanted to be seen as a mastermind.
Right. He was confronting complex machinery, but he was using blunt tools.
Which brings us to the most revealing aspect of his writing. If the codes tell us what he wanted us to hear, his grandiosity, his threats, his obsession with slaves in the afterlife, what does the underlying structure of his sentences reveal about his subconscious?
The linguistic fingerprint.
Exactly. Because you can fake an interest in cryptography, you can intentionally misspell words, but it is nearly impossible to fake the subconscious grammatical architecture of your own brain.
Moving from cryptography into forensic linguistics gives us an entirely new metric for analyzing his identity.
And for this, we are pulling from a highly specific, incredibly dense 2020 academic study published in the International Journal of English Literature and Social Sciences.
That's a fantastic paper.
The paper is titled "The Similarities of Thematic Progression in Zodiac Killer Letters." And to grasp how they analyzed his mind, we need to understand a branch of linguistics called systemic functional linguistics, and specifically a framework called thematic progression.
Right, they ignore the spooky stuff.
Yeah, the researchers didn't care about the threats or the blood. They stripped away the narrative content and looked purely at the structural geometry of how he built a clause.
So in systemic functional linguistics, every single clause can be divided into two foundational components: the theme and the reme.
Theme and reme, break that down.
The theme is the point of departure for the message, is what the clause is about, and it always occupies the initial position in the sentence. The reme is the remainder of the message. It is the new information or the development being provided about the theme.
Okay, it is helpful to visualize this with a baseline example. Take the sentence. The bat is a nocturnal animal.
Right.
The bat is the theme. It is the subject we are introducing. Is a nocturnal animal is the reme. It is the new information attached to the subject.
Perfect example. Thematic progression, then, is the study of how a writer connects the themes and remes from one sentence to the next to build a coherent paragraph.
How they link it all together.
Exactly. The paper outlines three primary patterns of progression. First is the constant theme. This is when the writer uses the exact same theme in successive clauses.
Like keeping the subject the same.
Yes. For example, the bat is nocturnal. It lives in dark caves. It hunts using echolocation. The theme, the bat, it remains entirely constant while the remes change.
Got it. What's the second pattern?
The second pattern is the linear or zigzag theme. In this progression, the reme, the new information of the first sentence, becomes the theme or the starting point of the next sentence. For instance, the academic board requires a specific documentation format. This format includes rigorous parenthetical citations. The documentation format was the end of the first clause, and it zigzags down to become the beginning of the second clause. It creates a chain of linked ideas.
That feels like a very natural way to write.
It is. And the third pattern is the multiple theme, or split reme progression. This occurs when the first sentence introduces a broad concept in the reme, and the subsequent sentences take individual pieces of that broad concept and turn them into new separate themes.
Give me an example of that one.
Sure. When you study Japanese writing, you must learn two phonetic alphabets and a system of ideograms. The phonetic alphabets are called hiragana and katakana. The ideograms are called kanji.
Oh, wow. So you introduce a complex idea, then split it into multiple new starting points.
Exactly. So picture the structural flow of these progressions. A normal, healthy conversationalist or writer uses a dynamic mix of all three patterns to move a narrative forward, relying heavily on linear progression to link complex ideas together.
Because that's how logical thought flows.
Right. But when the researchers applied this rigid diagramming to 12 different Zodiac communications, mapping the arrows from theme to reme across every single sentence, the statistical output was completely anomalous.
The data here is genuinely shocking. They found that an overwhelming 65.3% of the thematic progression in the killer's letters utilized the constant theme pattern.
Which is incredibly high.
18.36% utilized the multiple theme pattern. The linear zigzag pattern, which you just said is the primary tool for normal narrative flow, was practically non-existent.
Almost entirely absent.
But the true revelation is what that constant theme actually consisted of. In 65.3% of his clauses, the constant point of departure was the pronoun I.
In the terminology of the study, it is an unmarked theme, a nominal group consisting of a single pronoun. Clause after clause, paragraph after paragraph. The killer is structurally incapable of beginning a thought with anything other than himself.
I've killed 7 people.
I have grown rather angry.
I shall change the way.
I shall no longer.
I look like the description.
I must you to know about my latest slaves.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Reading the academic tables mapping out these sentences, the psychological reality becomes glaringly obvious. This rigorous empirical linguistic study mathematically proves his extreme pathological narcissism.
It maps it out scientifically.
Basically, his grammar proves his extreme narcissism. He's like a bad conversationalist at a party who literally cannot start a sentence with anything other than I.
We all know someone like that.
Right. Even when he is describing the victims or the police or the city of San Francisco, he subconsciously forces the grammatical structure to pivot around his own actions, his own rules, or his own perceived genius. He is the sun in his own grammatical solar system.
And this narcissistic architectural flaw serves a massive, definitive investigative purpose.
The hoax theory.
Yes. Because this specific pattern, the overwhelming reliance on the constant theme of I, coupled with his specific use of multiple themes to list his various grievances or accomplishments, is mathematically identical across all the analyzed letters, the researchers drew a hard conclusion.
Right, because for decades there has been this persistent fringe theory in true crime circles known as the Zodiac hoax theory.
Which is very popular online.
Yeah. This theory posits that there was no single Zodiac killer. Instead, it suggests that a few disconnected unsolved murders occurred, and then multiple different individuals, perhaps copycats, or even an ambitious journalist, wrote the various letters to synthesize a mythical supervillain for the press.
But the underlying mathematics of the grammar completely obliterates the hoax theory.
It just destroys it.
The researchers concluded that it is a statistical impossibility for multiple unconnected people to perfectly replicate this specific subconscious thematic progression.
Because you don't even know you're doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can consciously mimic someone's handwriting. You can intentionally copy their spelling errors, like writing paradise with a C. But it is nearly impossible for a human being to continuously subconsciously fake another person's deep thematic progression across multiple years of letters without their own natural linguistic patterns bleeding through.
Right.
The grammar proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we are looking at a solitary individual. One highly narcissistic, deeply isolated man.
Okay, so if the linguistics mathematically prove we are looking for one lone, deeply arrogant man with a fixation on cryptography and a geographic anchor in the Bay Area, why does the suspect list have 2,500 names on it?
Suspect fatigue.
Let's look at why identifying a man with such a specific psychological profile became an absolute nightmare of confirmation bias.
By the time the San Francisco Police Department compiled their data in 2009, they had formally investigated an estimated 2,500 suspects.
That number is just insane to me.
Yeah, it is. That is 2,500 men brought in, interviewed, researched, and filed away. The volume of investigative man-hours is almost incomprehensible.
And what is surely wild about reading through these suspect files is how many of these men look absolutely unequivocally guilty on paper.
Until you look closer.
Right. Let's examine the most prominent figure in the investigation, the only suspect the police ever publicly named, and the central figure in Robert Graysmith's definitive book on the case, Arthur Leigh Allen.
The prime suspect.
If you look at the circumstantial evidence matrix surrounding Allen, he seems to be the perfect fit. He lived in Vallejo, literally minutes away from the sites of the first 2 attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs.
Proximity.
Yeah. He was a former Navy man, which perfectly accounts for the military-issue wing-walker boot prints found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. He wore a brand of watch called Zodiac that literally featured the exact crosshair symbol the killer used to sign his letters.
And his behavioral and psychological timeline aligns disturbingly well with the escalation of the crimes.
It really does.
In 1968, shortly before the murders began, Allen was fired from his job as an elementary school teacher following allegations of sexual misconduct with a student. His life was actively unraveling.
The stressor.
Exactly. And going back further, shortly after the brutal murder of Cheri Jo Bates in Riverside in 1966, a crime heavily suspected by many investigators to be a precursor. The Zodiac murder employment records show Allen took his only sick day of the entire year.
That is quite the coincidence.
The investigative file also includes statements from a friend of Allen's who claims that in early 1969, Allen detailed an idea for a novel.
Oh, this part is crazy.
According to the friend, Allen said the book would feature a killer who called himself Zodiac, who would hunt young couples in lovers' lanes, send taunting letters to the police, and sign them with the crosshair symbol from his watch.
I mean, it sounds like a confession disguised as fiction. And then you add the survivor identification. Michael Mageau miraculously survived the horrific point-blank shooting at Blue Rock Springs in July 1969. In 1992, decades after the attack, investigators showed Mageau a photo lineup. He pointed directly at Arthur Leigh Allen's picture and stated, "That's him. He's the man that shot me."
A direct eyewitness identification.
Furthermore, the Zodiac communications abruptly stopped in 1974. Why would a serial killer who is addicted to the media spotlight suddenly go quiet? Well, in 1974, Arthur Leigh Allen went to state prison for child molestation. The timeline fits perfectly.
But this is where the structural engineering of the case collapses.
The physical evidence.
Right. Despite executing multiple high-profile search warrants on Allen's residences in 1972, again in 1991, and a final time in 1992, the hard, empirical forensic evidence completely failed to align.
Nothing matched.
Nothing. Allen's fingerprints were meticulously compared to the bloody prints pulled from Paul Stine's cab. They did not match. His palm prints did not match the latent prints found on the Zodiac letters. Highly trained forensic document examiners analyzed his handwriting and definitively concluded he did not author the letters. When partial DNA profiles were eventually developed from the saliva on the letter stamps, Allen was excluded.
He was just totally ruled out by science.
He maintained his innocence until his death in 1992, leaving investigators with a mountain of circumstantial smoke, but absolutely no forensic fire.
And because the forensic wall blocked Allen, the investigative community, both professional and amateur, simply pivoted to the next perfect suspect.
The list just kept growing.
In recent years, the alternative theories have exploded into a cottage industry. Take Gary Francis Post. In 2021, an independent investigative group known as the Case Breakers, comprised of former law enforcement officers and intelligence analysts, held a press conference publicly naming Post as the killer.
That made huge headlines.
Post was an Air Force veteran. The Case Breakers utilized facial recognition technology to compare photographs of Post to the police composite sketch, claiming that distinct scars on Post's forehead perfectly matched the lines drawn by the sketch artist.
The scar theory.
Yeah. They documented that Post wore a size 10.5 shoe, the exact size of the Wingwalker boot prints. They even claimed that if you removed Post's full name from the text of the Zodiac ciphers, it reconfigured the algorithm to reveal an alternate message.
But the pushback from official agencies was immediate.
They weren't buying it.
The FBI released a statement confirming the case remained open and unsolved, implicitly rejecting the Case Breakers' definitive conclusion. Prominent researchers pointed out the flaws in the methodology.
Like Tom Voigt, right?
Yes, Tom Voigt, a leading archivist of the case, noted a massive discrepancy regarding the scars. Not a single original witness, not Michael Mageau, not Brian Hartnell, who survived Lake Berryessa, and not the witnesses at Presidio Heights ever described the killer as having highly visible, distinct scars on his forehead.
Wait, really?
Really, the lines in the composite sketch were likely just artistic representations of forehead wrinkles on a man in his late 30s or 40s.
Yeah. Wow, okay. Then you dive into the files of Paul Dewar, a suspect brought to massive public attention in a 2022 book. Dewar was deeply embedded in the Bay Area fanzine culture of the 1960s, a publisher who was openly obsessed with cryptography and right-wing militias.
His timeline is interesting.
The circumstantial timeline here is incredibly tight. Just 3 days after the Zodiac mailed the famously unsolved Z13 cipher, Dewar published his own complex cipher in a Tolkien-themed fanzine using a runic alphabet known as Surth.
Which shows a high level of cryptographic interest.
And Dewar wrote extensively in his publications about the exact chemical formula for an ANFO bomb ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, which is the precise death machine explosive the killer threatened to use on the school buses.
That's a very specific detail.
It is. Dewar was also heavily involved in historical reenactment groups that wore medieval clothing, which theorists argue perfectly explains the bizarre, square-shaped executioner's hood the killer wore during the daylight stabbings at Lake Berryessa.
The costume connection.
Yeah. Dorer even published articles advocating for the use of single 1-cent stamps on envelopes to annoy the Postal Service, a highly specific, bizarre quirk that the Zodiac actually utilized on his letters.
And yet the sheer volume of suspects continues to expand into the present day. We are looking at sources from 2025 detailing an investigative report regarding a suspect named Marvin Margolis.
Tell us about Margolis.
According to a consultant named Alex Baber, Margolis was a Navy corpsman with extensive medical training. Baber's theory attempts to bridge two of the most infamous unsolved murders in California history, noting that Margolis actually had a documented romantic relationship with Elizabeth Short.
Wait, Elizabeth Short, as in the Black Dahlia.
Exactly, the victim of the 1947 Black Dahlia murder in Los Angeles. Baber claims to have applied a new decryption key to the unsolved Z13 cipher, revealing the name Marvin Merrill, an alias Margolis was known to use.
That's quite a leap.
The theory relies on his geographic proximity to the Bay Area in 1969, handwriting similarities between the Zodiac's letters and anonymous letters sent to the press during the Black Dahlia investigation, and Margolis's military access to the type of bayonet used in the Lake Berryessa attack.
And there's Kane, too.
Yes, we also have suspects like Lawrence Kane, who was identified from a photo lineup by Kathleen Johns, a woman who famously claimed the Zodiac abducted her and her infant child on a dark highway in 1970 before she managed to jump from the moving vehicle.
Right.
In 2021, a French engineer claimed he cracked the Z13 cipher using an entirely new methodology, concluding it read Care, which he theorized was a phonetic typo for Kane.
Reading through these files is just a dizzying experience. Every single one of these men, Allen, Post, Dewar, Margolis, Kane, when you isolate their specific circumstantial profile, you think the case is entirely closed.
They all look so guilty on their own.
Exactly. You look at the NFO bomb formula, the 1-cent stamps, the forehead scars, the Surth cipher, but they cannot all be the Zodiac killer.
Obviously not.
Staring at these suspect files is exactly like staring at clouds. If you stare at the clouds long enough, and you desperately want to see the shape of a dragon, your brain will construct a dragon out of the vapor.
That is precisely what's happening.
If you read the Zodiac files wanting to prove Arthur Leigh Allen's guilt, you will find a way to make the pieces interlock. If you want to see Gary Post, the stars suddenly become the key to the entire mystery. I really have to question. Has this massive 2,500-person suspect list actually advanced the investigation, or has it just generated so much circumstantial noise that it has completely paralyzed our ability to see the truth?
This raises an important question, and it's a masterclass in the dangers of confirmation bias and human pattern recognition.
Yeah.
We are an inherently pattern-seeking species. When we are confronted with a terrifying, empty silhouette, an unidentified serial killer who operates without a clear motive, our psychological imperative is to fill that void to restore our sense of safety.
We need a face.
We do. So investigators and amateur sleuth take the nearest available puzzle piece, the suspect they happen to be researching, and they forcefully jam it into the empty silhouette.
Even if it doesn't fit perfectly.
Right. They hyper-focus on the elements that align perfectly. The shoe size, the geographic timeline, the strange coincidences like the watch brand or the fanzine articles. Simultaneously, they conveniently shave off the edges of the puzzle piece that do not fit.
They ignore the bad data.
They dismiss the mismatched fingerprints, they rationalize the solid alibis, and they ignore the contradictory DNA. There was a highly publicized instance where a man named Gary Stewart wrote a best-selling book claiming his own biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the killer.
I remember that book.
The entire theory was based on a supposed resemblance to the composite sketches and a highly subjective interpretation of the ciphertext. The theory gained massive traction until independent investigators thoroughly debunked it by proving his father was out of the country, traveling in Europe during the time frame of the murders.
He wasn't even there.
The immense desire to finally solve the puzzle completely overrode objective historical reality. Suspect fatigue sets in when you realize that if you gather enough circumstantial data, you can build a compelling, terrifying case against almost any man who lived in Northern California in 1969, owned a typewriter, and had a military background.
If the circumstantial evidence is just a massive Rorschach test reflecting our own biases and desires to solve the case, we have to abandon the clouds.
We have to look at the science.
We have to look for something purely objective. We have to look at the biology. Which brings us to the most modern and arguably the most frustrating chapter of this entire saga, the modern DNA evidence.
The 2025 update.
Right. We have an exclusive update published on September 29th, 2025 from Tom Voigt on Zodiackiller.com detailing the Vallejo Police Department's handling of the genetic material.
To contextualize the immense weight of this 2025 update, we have to look at the timeline of the forensic evidence.
Set the stage for us.
The Vallejo Police Department, having jurisdiction over the first two attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, has maintained physical evidence in their lockers for over half a century.
Right.
In May 2018, the department made an announcement that generated massive global fanfare. They stated they were formally submitting key items of Zodiac evidence for advanced next-generation genetic testing.
Which was huge news.
It was. The explicit hope was that utilizing genealogical DNA, profiling the exact same revolutionary technique that had just been used to identify and capture the Golden State Killer, could finally put a definitive name to the Zodiac.
Everyone thought it was just a matter of time.
In March 2019, a highly anticipated update was released. The private lab had successfully extracted a usable genetic profile from the evidence. The process was moving forward. The entire true crime and law enforcement community prepared for an imminent identification.
Fast forward through 6 grueling years of silence, right up to September 2025. The Vallejo Police Department finally provides the definitive conclusion regarding that extracted genetic profile.
And the result?
The reality of the result is absolutely heartbreaking for anyone hoping for closure. According to the official update, the genetic profile that was so painstakingly obtained from the evidence belonged to an individual who definitively could not have been the Zodiac killer.
Let that sink in.
For privacy and investigative reasons, the department did not publicly disclose the identity of the person, only confirming that it was an absolute dead end.
This is the brutal, uncompromising reality of cold case forensics. We have been conditioned by television and modern procedural crime solving to view DNA as an infallible magic bullet.
Like it solves everything instantly.
Right. We expect it to instantly tell us the story of the crime. But DNA does not narrate a timeline. It merely proves biological presence at a specific moment.
That's a great distinction.
If you pull a microscopic DNA profile off the adhesive of a postage stamp attached to a 1969 letter, and that profile belongs to an innocent third party, what does the data actually mean?
It opens up so many problems.
It opens up a terrifying spectrum of contamination. Did a well-meaning police detective in 1969 handle the evidence without gloves, talking and breathing over the paper before forensic protocols were established?
Probably.
Does the DNA belong to a postal worker who sorted the mail? Does it belong to an unwitting roommate or acquaintance of the killer who simply licked the stamp as a favor, having absolutely no idea that the envelope contained a cipher and a bloody piece of Paul Stine's shirt?
Using a data analogy, it is like spending years hacking your way through firewalls to pull the exact metadata off a terrorist's server, only to realize that the IP address you recovered belongs to the barista at the local coffee shop where the suspect happened to use the public Wi-Fi.
Exactly.
It is an absolute devastating dead end. So what does this all mean? I have to ask you directly, looking at the totality of what we have just analyzed.
Okay.
If the DNA is a contaminated phantom, and the ciphers have been mathematically cracked but refuse to reveal a true name, and the prime suspects are all fading into history,
Right.
Where do we go from here?
In their 2025 statement, the Vallejo Police Department maintained the official stance that the hunt continues.
But practically speaking,
Realistically, we're witnessing the final transition of the Zodiac case. It is moving from an active, imminent law enforcement manhunt into the realm of archival historical investigation.
like Jack the Ripper.
Very much so. Barring the miraculous discovery of an entirely new cache of pristine primary evidence, a definitive confession letter hidden in a floorboard, or the recovery of the murder weapons with uncontaminated prints. The resolution of this case no longer resides with patrol officers. It resides in the hands of data analysts, academic linguists, and historians meticulously combing through 50-year-old files.
Let's pull all the threads of this deep dive together. We started on a foggy street corner in Presidio Heights, looking at the raw procedural failure that allowed a killer to walk away from the murder of Paul Stine, escalating his campaign from localized violence to a statewide psychological terror campaign targeting schoolchildren.
The shift to urban terrorism.
Right. We broke down the underlying mathematics of his warfare, learning from the University of Amsterdam how he weaponized symmetric cryptography in Kirchhoff's principle, and how David Orenchak's team utilized geometric transposition to finally shatter the 51-year-old Z340 cipher.
A monumental achievement.
We examined the subconscious architecture of his mind through systemic functional linguistics, proving mathematically that his overwhelming reliance on the constant theme of I defined him as a solitary, deeply narcissistic individual, fundamentally debunking the hoax theory.
The grammar didn't lie.
We navigated the dizzying, paralyzing maze of confirmation bias, looking at suspects like Arthur Leigh Allen, Paul Doerr, and Gary Postman, who look like perfect dragons in the clouds of circumstantial evidence, but who completely failed the rigorous tests of forensic reality.
The trap of suspect fatigue.
And finally, we confronted the sobering limitations of modern science in 2025, where the ultimate biological tool of DNA yielded nothing but a contaminated echo.
A total dead end.
To you, the listener, who wants the deep knowledge without the static, I hope you see that the true value of exploring the Zodiac is not simply in memorizing the grim timeline of a true crime case.
No, it's so much bigger than that.
It is about understanding the massive intersection of human disciplines. It takes classical cryptography, academic linguistics, behavioral psychology, and advanced biology all working in tandem to try and illuminate the darkest corners of human behavior.
Absolutely.
It exposes the incredible, tenacious power of human deduction while forcing us to accept the frustrating limits of our justice system.
Building on the sheer volume of source material we've covered today, I want to leave you with one final lingering concept to mull over.
Let's hear it.
In the plain text of the cracked Z408 cipher, the killer explicitly stated his motivation. He believed he was collecting victims as slaves for his afterlife. It is a grotesque, delusional fantasy born of extreme narcissism.
Right. Totally unhinged.
But look objectively at what his campaign actually achieved. By creating unbreakable codes, by writing taunting letters demanding front-page publication, and by constructing a phantom persona that has entirely consumed thousands of amateur sleuths, academics, computer scientists, and police detectives for over half a century. Did he actually achieve his twisted afterlife right here on Earth?
Oh, wow.
Are we, by endlessly obsessing over his puzzles, debating the merits of his suspects, and keeping his mythology alive in deep dives and articles, inadvertently acting as those very slaves he demanded? Is our unending attention the true paradise he was seeking?
That is an incredibly heavy, chilling reframing of the entire phenomenon. He never wanted the clean, binary resolution of a fingerprint database.
No, he wanted the myth.
He purposefully engineered the chaos. He wanted us lost in the fog, forever working on his machinery.
And we still are.
Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking for the underlying patterns in the data, and keep diving deeply into your own research. Until next time, stay curious.